Hey strangers, it's Christiana here. I just want to give you a heads up for this episode. It is a brutal one. We are going to be discussing acts of incredible violence with an axe and several murders, including the death of a child. If this is not about you, please take care of yourself and don't listen to this episode. We're not going to be offended. Go listen to a different one. Night has drawn its cloak over the bustling city. The skies have long since drawn dark, and the stars have made their appearance, piercing pinpricks into the dark velvet of the atmosphere. The street lamps are lit, casting a soft glow over the pavements. This is my home, you think to yourself. It has been my home for my entire life. You brush your dark hair off your forehead absently, noticing a thin sheen of sweat has formed on your palms. You can feel your heart beating faster than it should be, considering all you're doing is looking out the window. Your errant thoughts continue spiraling through your brain. This is my home, so why do I feel like a complete outcast in this place? Why do I feel like there's a target on my front door? Nights like this should be peaceful. They should be normal. They should be, but this night is anything but peaceful or normal. Up and down the streets, homes that normally would be dark with families going to sleep are lit up, music pouring out of the windows and doors. Down the street, a local nightclub is raucous with the sound of brass, string bass, and piano frantically playing out a swinging tune mixed with the sudden burst of high, strained laughter. You turn from the window to look over the brightly lit room of your own home. Your father sits in his armchair, stiffly holding a book in his lap. You haven't noticed him turn a page in several minutes. A closer look at his face tells you his eyes are glazed. Your mother sits across from him on the sofa, gazing at your two small twin sisters and smiling weakly as they hold hands and dance to the jazz music coming from the record player. You sigh. To them, this night is only abnormal because they're allowed to be up so late, dancing and giggling as the world goes dark outside the window. They don't understand the true reason for the jazz notes pouring up and down the streets, from every house and jazz club in New Orleans. They don't understand that this night is special, but for a really terrible reason. In the corner, the record reaches its end, the tinny sound of instruments fading away. Shakily, you step over to restart the music. After all, Axeman's orders. I'm Christiana.
And I'm Bree.
Settle in and put on a jazz record.
Because you're about to hear something strange.
Welcome to episode 11, Axeman.
That was a nice intro.
Thank you.
It's been a long time since we've done this.
I know, it's been like a second.
It's been like 2 months.
Yeah, it has been. Took a little mental health break.
It's good. It's good for you.
It is. Do that, people. Do
Yes.
that, listeners. So, what do you know about the Axeman of New Orleans?
Most of what I know comes from two sources, BuzzFeed Unsolved and then Time Suck,
Yes.
which are like the opposite spectrum of the same thing.
Yes, you're right.
Now that I think about that. It's been a while since I've watched the Axeman episode of BuzzFeed Unsolved. It was before they were on Watcher.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been a while since I'm pretty sure there was a Time Suck episode. It was an early 1900s serial killing spree.
Yes.
And there was a weird connection to jazz music, almost like the Jewish Passover.
Yes.
And they never actually caught the killer.
Correct. Yes. I'm going to give a brief overview here before I start to go into some history. The Axeman of New Orleans was a serial killer active in New Orleans from 1918 to 1919. It is possible the killer may have been committing crimes as early as 1911. So there was possible connection from the murders that were happening in 1910, 1911 to the 1918 to 1919 Axeman spree. Evidence as to how solid that connection is kind of goes back and forth depending on what source you read. The killer often used an axe in his crimes, earning them the pseudonym that is still used to this day. Many of the killer's victims were Italian grocers, making it seem as though the motive for the crimes may have been racism. And you may have noticed that I remain gender neutral and did not mention a name in this description, and that's because, like Bree said, spoilers, the killer was never caught or identified.
It's true. They could have been female.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know.
Very possible.
Although, in general, I think most violent crimes are perpetrated by males. And
yeah, I think there's statistics that say women that commit crimes typically poison or things like that. But my girl Lizzie Borden, I shouldn't say my girl. Like, we're friends.
My good friend Elizabeth Borden.
You know, can't count it out. We're gonna pull a Sophia here. Picture it, New Orleans, 1900s. Italians had an established business force in New Orleans since before the Civil War. Many of the Italians that first arrived in New Orleans were from northern Italy, but by the 19th century, many Sicilian people began to arrive as well. And from what I could tell, there was a need for laborers in the sugar fields that Sicilian immigrants were able to fill. Let's see.
What does pulling a Sophia mean?
Oh, from Golden Girls.
I can't find that show for free.
Oh, you're right. You have not seen Golden Girls. Okay, we're gonna have to find it. Sophia is Dorothy's mom in the Golden Girls, and she's forever talking about her time in Sicily when she was alive. So she's forever going, picture it, Sicily, insert ear here, and I love it. So from what I could tell, there was a need for laborers in the sugar fields that Sicilian immigrants were able to fill, and that's why they were coming from Sicily. By the year 1900, New Orleans contained the largest population of Italians in the entire South, numbers some 20,000 people. The Italians didn't have a great reputation in the white deep South for several reasons. One of which was they were working in the sugar fields on these big plantations, and if they were frugal, they were able to save money to support themselves and eventually leave that job. And this upset these planters because they felt like they couldn't keep workers. So basically, how dare these people,
better themselves?
Start, how dare they save their money to be able to, support themselves through other means. White people also viewed these immigrants that were willing to work in the fields as lower class and not in a particularly flattering light, i.e. slavery. However, the Italian immigrants weren't familiar with the views that many Southerners held at the time. So if you think about, I know it's quite 50 years or so after the Civil War happened, this country was still extremely racist. The Civil War didn't end that. Black people, African-American people, anyone who wasn't white, essentially, that was working in a field, even though slavery wasn't necessarily happening anymore, they were still looked at as oh, they're no better than... I'm not saying this is my view, this is point of view at the time. Oh, they're, quote, no better than slaves, which is a terrible thing to think about. These Italians didn't have that view. They were just oh, we're going to go out. This is a job that we're able to fill and we're able to earn money, and then we can get away from it. They didn't have that understanding of how this country differed from Sicily in that way. They didn't find anything shameful about it. Again, I say they were just working as laborers and for as long as they needed to until they had enough money squirreled away that they could move on and do something else. Due to these unpopular views, Italians began to face really serious racial prejudice despite being very successful in and of themselves. And despite facing their neighbors' unpopular views, stereotypes, and discrimination, many Italian immigrants became grocers and did very, very well. By 1900, 19% of groceries were Italian-owned. And I didn't really segue into this very well, so to be clear, I'm just trying to paint a background picture of what was happening in New Orleans leading up to these Axeman attacks. Some of these views that American non-immigrant citizens were having of Italians will start to make sense the more you hear about these Axeman attacks. So I do want to talk about some crime that was happening in the Italian communities before we move forward. To be clear, I'm not justifying the crimes that were committed by the Axeman here. I'm just trying to give, a well-rounded picture of the time period that we're living in. So while many Italians did very, very well in New Orleans, crime did still happen in their communities. In Sicily, there was a type of justice called the vendetta that occurred up to the 20th century. Italian immigrants in New Orleans tended to be a little bit clannish. That was a quote from one of my sources, not me. And distrusted the police. So they would often use this style of justice to settle disputes rather than calling in authorities to settle issues. And vendetta, according to the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, is defined as the following: 1, a blood feud, or 2, an often prolonged series of retaliatory, vengeful, or hostile act or exchange of such acts. So essentially it sounds like vigilante justice.
And I would say, and this is just me talking off of like the top of my head,
Mm-hmm.
in general, once again, I'm not like defending any actions here.
Mm-hmm.
When a new group of immigrants would come into the U.S. from different cultures, different countries, they would tend to be very, very close-knit.
Of course.
I mean, like, look at like the Irish when they came in. They also got a lot of racism and a lot of injustice, right?
Exactly.
I mean, the same with like the Pennsylvania Dutch in Pennsylvania literally spoke their own language. So I'm imagining from like the outsiders.
Yeah, they're like, and you know, they already had really poor views by their neighbors, didn't understand why their neighbors were judging them so harshly. So of course, like, why would they trust the police?
Yeah.
They're like, if we take this to police, they're just gonna brush it under the table. I don't know that for certain, but like, I imagine that's probably mindset of the time.
There was a cultural thing of like distrusting outsiders, I would say too. If it didn't fit the quote unquote mold, and this is just me talking like out of a hat at this point. But like you were saying, it, you know, I can understand their thought process of we're not going to trust the police. We're going to take care of this ourselves because we don't know that it'll be taken care of in a just and fair way.
Exactly. So there was a street called, I believe it's pronounced Decatur Street.
Sure.
Decatur. If I'm pronouncing that wrong, someone please correct me. This was actually nicknamed Vendetta Alley due to the number of shootings and knife fights that occurred there.
What a good band name.
Right, Vendetta Alley.
Not that knife fights and shootings are funny, but like, if you're in New Orleans and you're like trying to form a band,
sick band name.
We get 10% of the proceeds for pulling that off for you.
Come support our podcast. So Italian gangs were also present in New Orleans, but according to a historian quoted in one of the articles I referenced, which was out of Smithsonian Magazine, they weren't technically mafia. I did start to dig a little bit into this, but I was getting too in the weeds, so I backed off. The history of the mafia and the mafia coming to this country is extremely complex.
I was curious about that because when you said about them and I don't know very much about the mafia, I didn't know if there's any ties there, but you answered that question.
It's okay. There was also crime known as Black Hand crime, which was essentially extortion. A victim was forced to pay a certain amount of money and were threatened with acts of violence if they couldn't/wouldn't pay. And this act only disappeared when the descendants of immigrants became sufficiently Americanized to complain to the police. That was a quote. So essentially, this is more evidence of the Italian immigrants solving their own problems via the systems that they were used to, rather than involving American authorities, until it got to a certain point where they were either living here long enough or like generationally they had been in this country long enough that they started to be a little more into like mainstream American culture versus strictly right off the boat from Sicily or Italy. So another bit of crime that I want to go into that was heavily referenced in the Smithsonian Magazine was the murder of David Hennessy. In 1890, one particular event especially created discourse between Italian immigrants and the citizens of New Orleans. I should say American citizens of New Orleans, which was the murder of David Hennessy. David Hennessy was the New Orleans police chief and did not have the cleanest history. Hennessy was responsible for arresting an Italian criminal by the name of Giuseppe Esposito. Esposito had been imprisoned in Italy for kidnapping and extortion, but managed to bribe his way out of the prison. From there, he immigrated to New Orleans and began his malarkey all over again, and he was not quiet about it. This made him very easy to find. After being apprehended, Esposito was extradited back to his home country, where he was then sentenced to life in prison. However, this wasn't enough for David Hennessy. According to the one article I referenced, he didn't receive a promotion after catching Esposito, which upset him. So he decided the best course of action would be to shoot the chief of detectives, Thomas Devereaux, with the help of his cousin.
Wait, what? Hennessy decided that because he got passed over, the most helpful course of action was to shoot a higher up person in the... Okay,
I was reading this too. I was like, oh, okay. This makes so this guy's real shady.
This makes no sense, but continue.
Yeah. The two, Hennessy and his cousin, were acquitted of the murder after claiming self-defense, but Hennessy was still removed from the police force, until 1888. At that point, he was rehired and made chief of police by the new mayor, Joseph Shakespeare. We're going to talk about him a little later. He's not especially pure intention either. We'll put it that way.
Was there any evidence that it was self-defense?
So I didn't see too much of that. I believe the most of what I got on David Hennessy came from an article from, actually, I wanted to talk about this museum anyway, because it sounds really cool. It's called the Mob Museum, and I believe it's in Vegas, and it talks about, the whole museum is about, like, the history of the mob and organized crime, which I was like, this is really cool. And they had all kinds of really fascinating articles on their website, but I want to visit there now.
That sounds very interesting.
Yeah, it was cool. I was looking at it, I'm like, this is awesome. Like, this is a really cool museum. So check it out, y'all. So the article kind of like glanced over that. Like, they didn't really talk too much about that particular shooting. And I didn't go too much further into it because I didn't want to go too far into the weeds. So fast forward to the fateful year 1890, where Hennessy once again became entangled with Italian crime in the form of two rival groups who each had a monopoly on the fruit trade, introducing the groups of Joseph Provenzano and Carlo Matranga. The two groups ended up in a shootout on May 6, 1890, that resulted in deaths on both sides. In the aftermath, 7 men loyal to Provenzano were convicted of murder. However, Hennessy disagreed with this verdict, and as it turns out, Hennessy was friendly with the Provenzanos and was supposedly involved in their side business, which was a brothel. I don't know the truth of that. It's just what I read. Yeah.
He has lots of hobbies.
He has lots of hobbies. He also provided witnesses for their trial that backed up the defendants' alibis. Once the guilty verdicts were announced, Hennessy decided that he was going to step up and help in their appeal. In October that year, several days before the new trial was set to take place, Hennessy was shot by several unknown assailants while walking home. Supposedly, as he lay in the street, he stated something along these lines, and I want to give a quick trigger warning here because there is a slur. The quote is, "The Dagos shot me," or the got me, something along those lines. I'm not going to say that word again. Hennessy then died the next day after the shooting. So this murder resulted in a massive roundup of Italians that could anyway have been suspected of being involved in this murder. A direct quote from the Mob Museum website was, "Mayor Shakespeare ordered them to, quote, arrest every Italian you come across if necessary." The mayor also organized a citizens group called the Committee of 50, another direct quote, to investigate and eliminate mafia groups.
Man, that's wrong on so many levels. Like, let's just round up everyone of a single ethnicity.
Yes, exactly. And this Committee of 50 is a citizens group. Why do you have citizens going after supposed mafia groups? Especially when there's evidence that the mafia wasn't even in. Like, there's a lot of unpleasant characters here.
There's a lot of ickiness going on.
Yes. As I said above, there was no evidence that the actual mafia was involved in New Orleans. The Mob Museum article also stated that there was no evidence to show that there was mafia involved in Hennessy's murder. However, this term mafia was used to make, like, rivals look bad, so it sounded like even the groups on trial were, like, throwing the term at each other, trying to, like, disparage each other, essentially. As you can imagine, the use of the term mafia was also very inflammatory. One man, Thomas Duffy, went to the prison where the Italians were being held on the day of Hennessy's funeral, and he shot one of the prisoners in the neck. He was quoted as saying, "I'm willing to hang if one of those dies. D-word, dies." So, like, messed up. However, he was only sentenced to 6 months in prison.
For, like,
shooting homicide. A man in the neck.
For, like, yes. Yeah, for the literal murder. Okay.
Like, quite literally shooting a caged man. Ugly. The violence didn't end there. While many of the men were eventually released, there were 19 men who were imprisoned, and eventually 9 of these 19 men were sent to trial in early 1891. The trials resulted in 6 men being acquitted and mistrials for 3 of these men due to a hung jury. The defendants were all taken back into custody for their own safety, according to the article. To be clear here, because the math was confusing me a little bit when I was doing this research, all 19 of these men are now back in prison.
Okay.
Supposedly for their own safety. The acquittals enraged many of in New Orleans, and the Committee of 50 organized a town meeting to decide how to move forward. As you can imagine, this did not end well. This meeting turned into a mob that marched on the Orleans Parish Prison, where they lynched 11 of these prisoners. They shot most of them, but they did hang 2 of them outside the prison walls. Of the 19 men, 8 were able to escape.
So what happened to the people that literally went in and murdered people in a prison?
Literally nothing.
Of course not.
Mayor Shakespeare was quoted as, like, essentially saying they did the right thing.
Like, oh yeah, we'll just...
They were saying things like, when the justice system fails, the American people have to step up. What was happening around the late 1800s, early 1900s. Again, I kind of wanted to put all that in there. That's not directly related to the Axeman, but it gives you an idea of what Italian immigrants were facing at this time. Wasn't a very nice place. We'll say it that way.
No, it was not a good environment.
No, not at all. So I'm going to fast forward here to 1918, when these Axeman attacks first started happening. The Axeman committed 6 murders for certain and injured 6 others. The first victims were Joseph and Catherine Maggio. The couple was murdered on May 23rd, 1918, while sleeping in their apartment. And Joseph was an Italian grocer. The couple was found by Joseph's brothers, Jake and Andrew. Andrew lived in the apartment next door. And good old Wikipedia, stated that Joseph was actually still alive when his brothers found him, but that he died shortly after. However, I didn't see corroboration with this in other articles. So if he did find him alive, that's terrible.
He would have been barely alive.
Yeah, he would have been one. Yeah.
Ugh.
Both the couple's throats were slit before they were bludgeoned with an axe. And I want to give a trigger warning here because this is very graphic. Catherine's throat was slit so deeply that she was nearly decapitated. So this attacker was brutal. When police arrived at the scene, they found that a panel in the back door of the house had been removed. They also found bloody clothing that they believe belonged to the murderer, meaning that the murderer had changed before leaving the house.
Smart.
Yeah, unfortunately. A straight razor was later found in a neighboring lawn that did turn out to belong to Andrew himself, the brother.
Yeah.
Andrew then became the prime suspect of police. He owned a barber shop, which is why he had the straight razor in the first place. Some of the research that I was looking at said that one of Andrew's employees made a statement that Andrew had removed the razor from the shop 2 days before the murder. And then some of the research I read said that he had removed it to hone a nick out of the blade. Andrew also didn't have the most solid alibi, unfortunately. It was stated that he was drunk in his apartment at the time of the murders. So he claimed to hear groaning through the walls, but wasn't able to do anything because he was just so intoxicated. He also stated that he did see a figure lurking near his brother and sister-in-law's apartment.
Like that same night? Or like, was he saying it was an earlier time?
If I understand right, it was like that same evening. He saw like a creepy figure lurking around.
Okay. Because I didn't know if it was like a thing of like, yeah, I noticed some weirdo outside.
Like the other night, or
yeah.
I'm sorry.
You're good. Or it was just like, yeah, I was so drunk I thought it was a shadow, but who the heck knows? Maybe it's a tree.
Yeah, truly. Like if I understood the research correctly, it was like that same night he had noticed someone lurking around.
Okay.
So, despite the absolutely, unfortunately, damning circumstantial evidence, Andrew was eventually released due to police being able to completely break his alibi. They weren't unable to say, like, they didn't have a smoking gun 100% tying him to the case.
Okay.
So, he was released. From there, we're going to move to the next attacks on I'm not sure if it's Louis or Louis Bessemer and Harriet Ann Lowe. This attack occurred on June 28th, 1918. So this would have been the next month. There was a difference in this attack versus the attack on Joseph and Catherine in that Louis's grocery was actually a Polish grocery rather than Italian.
So they were Polish and not Italian.
Correct.
Oh, I mean, the Polish weren't super well liked at that time either.
Exactly.
That's about when my family would have come over.
Oh, nice. Okay. I hope they weren't.
No, they didn't go to New Orleans. They went to Reading, Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
Come over late 1800s, early 19.
Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, immigration in this country has never been treated especially kindly. So, Louis and Harriet, and I read that Harriet was Louis's mistress, possibly his common-law wife. Not entirely sure. But either way, they were both struck in the head with an axe while sleeping in the back quarters of Louis's grocery. Louis had been struck above his right temple. Harriet was struck over the left ear. Miraculously, both of them immediately survived the attack. Harriet, however, was left with half of her face paralyzed, and she did succumb to her injuries that she sustained several weeks later.
Did he survive?
He did.
Like, past he
yes,
survived? Okay.
He survived. After the attacks, an axe that turned out to belong to Louis himself was found in the bathroom. One source I read stated that the axe was broken into 2 pieces. I only found that one place, so take it with a grain of salt. A bread delivery man, John Zanka, discovered this couple the morning after the attacks. And I didn't see anywhere that Zanka himself was considered a suspect, but police were very quick to arrest an African-American man who had visited the shop a week prior to the attacks, whose name also was Louis. I believe it's Obekin.
There's just like rampant racism in this.
It's
in
a
this
rough episode.
Yeah.
The police claimed that Obekin's, if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, I apologize, it's Oubicon. The police claimed that Obekin's whereabouts couldn't be confirmed at the time of the murders. However, he was thankfully released after a week when the police couldn't find more concrete evidence against him, which, like, he visited the shop a week prior and you decided he was a murderer.
It was like literally, It was literally that he visited the place at the wrong time.
Pretty much, yeah. And I just thought it was interesting because, like, and I guess I shouldn't say John Zanka was never considered a suspect because maybe he was and I just couldn't find documentation of it. But that was where my first thoughts went to. It's like, okay, bread delivery man could have shown up at the shop. He obviously knows how to get in. As far as I was aware, he was never considered a suspect. Unless
he had an alibi, like he was off delivering bread
at
that time.
That's true. Like he might not have been on the scene long enough to have done the crime.
Yeah.
So just thoughts that went through my brain as I was.
That is interesting that he was never even considered.
Yeah.
Unless he had a really tight alibi, like, yes, I was up the street at this person's shop, or I was at my bread shop. You can ask.
Yeah, or, like, this person saw me walk into the shop and then saw me walk out 2 minutes later, like, this couple. Something like that. So the weeks leading up to Harriet's death were kind of wild, to put it simply, and actually led to the arrest of not Louis Obicon, but Louis Bessemer.
The one who was killed.
Correct. Or, well, the one that was also attacked. He survived.
Oh, sorry. Also attacked. You're right.
That's okay. Harriet started making some kind of wild claims about the attacks and about Louis himself. She stated that he was a German spy because she found him with foreign correspondence. Louis was also detained by police for 2 days after this allegation, but then was released. The final straw, though, was when Harriet claimed that it was actually Louis himself who was the murderer. Well, in this case, who was the attacker, shortly before she died. This led to Louis being arrested and then imprisoned for 9 months. This was problematic for several reasons. No one had witnessed Louis attacking Harriet. As well, she made the statement while afflicted with severe head trauma, as well as being heavily sedated.
I was going to ask if that was ever brought up, because that's going to affect your memory and she might not be able to tell reality from...
Exactly. She could have been hallucinating. She could have been anything. And that's not to say,
that he
couldn't have done it, but it should be taken into account at the very least. An article I used from the website The Lineup stated, the police always had their suspicions about Bessemer due to his injuries being significantly less severe than Lowe's and his apparent lack of emotion towards Lowe's critical condition. And to me, that just points to further racism as well as confirmation bias. So I already said here, Harriet could have been telling the truth. She very well could have been. But the fact that she was so heavily sedated and had such severe head trauma needed to have been considered in her testimony or her statement. And I don't know that it was given proper credence. And as well, this is something I'm going to mention morbid here again. They say in the Morbid podcast, people react to trauma and grief differently. Just because you're not crying on the outside doesn't mean you're not sad. Just because you're not completely losing your mind and being like, oh my God, but this person is, that doesn't mean he wasn't feeling badly about it. Or that's just not a good way to be like, oh, that person's guilty because they're not crying.
Well, some people with trauma react in a more outward reaction, and some people dissociate.
Yeah. So
if, it's also possible that he went the opposite of being reactive and just completely, if you physically can't leave, your brain leaves for you.
Exactly. And I don't know if he was hit first or if Harriet was hit first, but just think about, you either wake up and the person next to you is covered in blood and you're like, oh God, before you literally get hit in the face with an axe, or you're awoken from a dead sleep because you just got hit in the face with an axe. You roll over and look at the person laying in bed next to you just to see them get brutally, either way, that's a horrifically traumatizing experience to have.
And it's also possible that depending on where he got hit, that might have affected those parts of the brain, right?
Sure.
And maybe expressive emotion was damaged.
Yeah.
So I agree with you. It could be a combination of a trauma response and just depending on where he got hit, maybe there was some damage there as well.
Absolutely.
That he's not going to react.
And they also stated his wounds were less brutal than hers. He had an axe wound to his temple. There have been true crime cases that I have heard where a person will go back and injure themselves.
How would you do that with an axe? To get the swing enough to get your own head?
Yeah, exactly. And here's a fun story.
I'm just trying to figure this out, sorry.
So here's a fun story that I'm going to tell about myself because I'm an absolute fool. I almost chopped the tip of my finger off with a hatchet one time.
Not on purpose, I hope.
Not on purpose. I was at a reenactment and was chopping firewood to make fire for lunch, and I got myself pretty good. And I was not swinging that axe particularly hard because I was just trying to cut kindling up. So it wasn't like I was whole off and splitting a huge piece of wood. But it got me pretty good. Thankfully, I still have my finger, friends. But I did have to have my fingernail removed and a couple sutures put in. And, so it can cause damage, but still, like, to be able to swing a hatchet into your own face.
This is a gruesome question.
Yes.
Did it break the skull?
I don't know if there was evidence of a skull fracture or not. I cannot remember.
Because you would need a pretty big... I think the skull is fairly thick.
Yeah. And, well, I think depends on where you hit, too, because I think your temporal lobes are a little bit... or not temporal lobes, that's the brain, but, like, your temple is a little bit more delicate than, like, the back of your skull.
Or probably even your forehead.
Or even your forehead, yeah. But, I mean, I could... And this is just me personally speculating. Do not take this as any form of gospel. I could maybe see someone injuring, like, their hand with a hatchet or, like, another part of their body. To be able to get the gumption up to swing that into your face to the point where you injure yourself badly enough to look like, oh, I was attacked.
Mm-hmm.
That, you'd have to be awful gutsy. Ugh.
I also just don't, and maybe, like, I've never tried this, the range of motion.
Yeah.
Like, I can't imagine, like, getting the range of motion.
Because
you'd end up hitting your temple. Like, if they're going for the forehead, that would be really...
It'd be a weird, yeah.
I don't know. Anyways, that got a little gruesome.
It just is, to me, it just is like, oh, well, your injuries were less bad, so you definitely did this. Like...
Do you know what's a funny thought that I'll probably cut out?
Yes.
So, like, we're having a very, very casual conversation about someone getting bludgeoned to death. And earlier today, I had to cut up a pork roast, and it grossed me out so much, the idea of touching raw meat, that I had to use a fork to hold it instead of touching it. But we're just having a conversation about someone getting bludgeoned with with an axe, and it's not even a problem.
Yeah. It's hypotheticals.
I think so.
So,
anyway, sorry.
That's all right. So there's all that to be taken into account. And
man,
perhaps the third and most, again, damning thing that was problematic in Lewis getting arrested for the being the supposed murderer was other victims were attacked while Lewis was in custody for 9 months.
So we either have a copycat,
or
we have the wrong person.
Exactly. Yeah.
Or what if there was more than one?
Well, let's go.
Sorry.
No,
Sorry.
It's okay. It's all right. So, thankfully, Lewis was acquitted in May of 1919 after the jury deliberated for all of 10 minutes and said, yeah, we don't think he's guilty.
This doesn't make a whole lot of sense, yeah.
Right. So he was released, thank goodness. Sorry that it took 9 months, but thankful. Our third victim is the name, I could not find this woman's first name. And
poor lady.
I know. It really makes me sad. Her last name was Schneider. Her first name was either Mary or Anna. I'm going to go ahead and just call her Miss Schneider to try and respect who she was. Miss Schneider, if you're listening from somewhere, I am really sorry I don't know your name. I wish it was documented because you deserve to have your story told.
Or a relative if they're listening. If you could tell us what her name was, just send us... We'll tell you how to contact us at the end of the episode.
We will. And honestly, if a relative of one of these people wants to come and, like, just chat with us, that'd be awesome. That being said, I do want to give extra trigger warning here. This particular case does involve brutal injuries and pregnancy, but it ends well for both the mother and child. So I just want to make that clear in the beginning here.
So she survived and we still don't know her first name.
Yeah.
Man.
I know. Miss Schneider was attacked on August 5th, 1918, while sleeping in her home. She was 8 months pregnant at the time. Miss Schneider's husband came home from work late one night and discovered her with her scalp split open and her face covered in blood. He rushed her to a nearby hospital to be treated for her injuries, and 2 days later, she gave birth to a healthy little girl.
So she was premature by like a month.
Yeah.
I'm guessing the trauma to the body probably triggered.
Yeah. But little girl was healthy. Mom survived. Baby was fine. All ended well there. So I just want to, because was a really upsetting when I realized she was 8 months pregnant when he attacked her. I mean, any of this is upsetting, but like, my God, that's terrible. While Miss Schneider did suffer amnesia from the event, stating she couldn't remember anything from before the attacks, she did remember waking to find a dark figure looming over her. Police found no evidence of a break-in at the scene, and there was actually no evidence of an axe being used at the scene. This led to the conclusion that Miss Schneider had been bashed in the head with a bedside lamp.
Ugh.
Yeah. I do want to note here that even though it was decided an axe was not the murder weapon, 2 of my sources stated an axe was stolen out of the couple's shed. Again, one suspect was arrested after the attack, a man named James Gleason. Gleason was supposedly an ex-convict. However, once again, the suspect was released due to lack of evidence. It seems to be a pattern here. And at this point, the authorities began to speculate that these attacks could be related. We're going to move on to the 4th attack, a man named Joseph Romano. This attack occurred the night of August 10th, 1918. So this was very close to the Miss Schneider attack.
Yeah.
Joseph was not a grocer, but he was an Italian barber whose family operated a small grocery out of the front of their home. Joseph was found with a deep gash in his head by his 2 nieces, Pauline and Mary Bruno. The girls had heard a disturbance in their uncle's adjoining bedroom, and when they rushed in, they found their uncle covered in blood. Per Wikipedia, Joseph had received 2 cuts to the head. Per the lineup article, it said the slice in his head was said to have cut down, trigger, this is brutal, cut down to the brain. The lineup article didn't specifically state he had 2 cuts. I don't think it's out of the question. Either way, this was bad. The girls also discovered the assailant fleeing the scene when they entered the bedroom, but they weren't able to get a good look at him. They stated it was a man who was heavyset and wearing a suit and slouch hat, but that was all they could really see. The lineup article stated that Joseph was actually able to walk out to the ambulance that came for him, but unfortunately 2 days later he did pass away in the hospital due to the severe head injury.
Wow.
Yeah. Police at the scene found a panel of the back door had been chiseled out, just like the scene at the attack on the Maggios. They also found a bloody axe in Joseph's backyard. At this point, New Orleans was in a state of constant fear from another attack. The police had started receiving multiple reports of people supposedly seeing the killer around their neighborhoods, which was like, from what I could tell, no one had got a good look at this guy, so I don't know why people were saying that, but I am sure at this point, anyone that even looked even slightly suspicious, people were probably panicking because these were so brutal. Some had also called reporting that they have found random axes in their backyards. So the city was just in a state of panic at this point. The next attack is on the Cortimiglia family. I want to give a big trigger warning here. This is probably the most brutal attack of all of them, and this one does involve death of a young child. It is really horrible, really sad. If you're not in a place to listen to this, please skip ahead. So the attack on the Cortimiglia family and its aftermath is, like I said, particularly brutal. It occurred on March 10th, 1919. So there was a bit of a break between the murders here. And it actually occurred in the neighboring town of Gretna, Louisiana, instead of New Orleans. Rose Cortimiglia was asleep in bed when she awoke to find her husband, Charles, engaged in a fight with an unknown assailant. The intruder struck both Charles and Rose over the head with an axe, and after subduing the couple, they turned to the 2-year-old daughter, Mary, who they attacked in the same way. Rose and Charles would survive their injuries. Mary sadly passed away in her mother's arms after the attack.
Oh, that's awful.
This is really bad. I'm so sorry, guys. Rose and Charles were taken to the hospital where Charles was released after 2 days. Rose, however, needed to stay in the care of the doctors a while longer. Once again, the police found a panel chiseled out of the back door, as well as the bloody axe on the family's back porch. The ugliness of this particular case, unfortunately, doesn't just stop at the attacks. Rose accused her neighbors, Mirando and Frank Giordano, of being the perpetrators. I want to put a note in here. It's possible that the Cortimiglia family was found by the Giordano's.
Sure it's not Giordano's?
It might be Giordano's, actually.
I don't know.
Well, with it being Italian, it might actually be
Yeah,
Giordano's.
it probably wouldn't be a J.
Okay.
It wouldn't be a J sounding
Okay.
I could be wrong, though.
It's American spelling is Jordanos. I think you're right, so I'm gonna go ahead and say Jordanos. One of the sources I used stated that the Jordanos found the unconscious forms of the Cortimiglia family after hearing screams coming from their house. However, another source stated that it was a different neighbor that initially found the family. I think it's a good thing to say here, and I told this to Bree before we started recording. Some of the resources I was finding for this were really, really different from one another, we'll say. Like, when I'm doing a true crime case, especially, I try to find multiple resources, and I read through all of them to make sure what I'm reading matches up, or that there are certain details that aren't in one article that could be in another one that could be interesting to add to the case. And most of the time, at least when I did Chowchilla, everything pretty well matched up. Half of the research for this was getting stuff was saying things completely different from the other half of the research, including who survived and who didn't.
Is it a time period thing?
I don't know. There was one, and I linked all of them because I did technically use them all. If you go to these links, please I did my best. That's all I'm going to say. But take it with a grain of salt. One was Ghost City Tours, and it stated that 2 or 3 of the victims that were towards the end of the Axeman spree died, but at least I believe one of them did, but 2 of them survived. But they stated they died at the scene, and I'm like, there was a magazine article that also stated it actually stated Charles Cortimiglia didn't survive his injuries, but everything else I was reading said it did. So I was like, what is happening in this research?
If anyone listening runs a ghost tour in a ghost tour agency, I apologize for what I'm about to say next. Sometimes they do sensationalize.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that there are ghost tour agencies that are much more historical in view, right?
Oh, sure.
But there are some that do try to make stories to match the ghosts.
Yeah. And it's especially in this case, these stories are bad enough.
Yeah, they're
you don't need to make them worse.
I also kind of wonder if it's just the time period. Mm-hmm. We're talking late 19 teens.
Yeah.
So right. I don't know that fact checking was as available at that time either.
Wasn't as available. Have to take into effect or into account the general feeling of the city at the time was not very positive towards immigrants. Mm-hmm. I just want to be clear. I hope I'm not saying stuff that turns out to be incorrect. I did do my best. I did link everything. That being said, back to what this statement was, the article that said the neighbor, I think it was this article that said a different set of neighbors found the Cortimiglias and then the Jordanos came and found them, was one that stated, again, Charles didn't survive this attack, when from what I could tell, he did survive. So take this with a grain of salt. Either way, the Jordanos, it seems like, came across them right after they were injured, and that's terrible that they had to see that. So the Cortimiglias and the Jordanos had been close for a while before these attacks. However, tensions started to rise between the families when the Cortimiglias opened their own grocery, which would compete with the Jordanos' grocery. So there was a little bit of rivalry there. The police did arrest the Jordanos as suspects in the attacks and murder, but there were problems with this. Again, first, Lorlando was a 68-year-old man with health problems. In particular, I was reading that he had arthritis, which it was surmised would have made it very difficult for him to wield the axe to commit this kind of brutal attack. Lorlando's son, 17 or 18 years old, depending on which source you look at, Frank, was a very big guy. He was 6 feet tall and weighed around 200 pounds, which would have made it impossible for him to fit through the chiseled out opening in the door.
That was a question I had for later of how big was this opening? Mm-hmm. But then I was like, okay, is it small enough that a grown man would have had a hard time getting through it? But depending on where it was chiseled out at, could it have been, I'm going to reach around and unlock the door?
you had the same... Yeah, we can save it for final thoughts, if that's okay.
Okay, we'll come back to that.
Okay.
Put a pin on that.
Put a pin. So when Rose was released from the hospital, the police also wrote up an account of the murder, making Frank and Lorlando out to be the main perpetrators, and Rose was forced to sign it, even though she couldn't read English. Despite the shoddy evidence, Lorlando and Frank were sent to trial and convicted for the attacks on Rose and Charles and the murder of Mary. Lorlando was sentenced to life in prison. Frank was sentenced to hang. One of my sources stated that Charles constantly denied his wife's accusations, and he divorced her after the trial. So, and he, you know, if you remember, he was actually fighting with one of the assailants. So that would tell me, I mean, he could have been in total fight or flight response, like kind of like blind to what he was seeing, just in full self-defense mode. Chances are, if he was right on top of that guy, he would have been able to say that definitely was or definitely wasn't. Or was likely to be this person. So it caused 2 men to be convicted of murder and attacking them, and it caused a divorce between her and her husband. Thankfully, despite all the ugly that came out of this attack and its aftermath, there was some good that came out a year later. In 1920, Rose ended up retracting her statement about Frank and Lorlando. She stated that she had falsely accused the men of the attack due to all the tensions between their rival stores. And in the end, the charges against both of them were dropped. Thank God. So neither one of them got hung for this, thankfully. Okay. All right. So we're going to take a little bit of a break from the brutality going on. This is one of the most infamous parts of this case. If you're familiar with true crime, you likely know this case because of the Axeman letter, the infamous Axeman letter.
I'm shaking my head. I'm sorry. I'm not just like,
no, it's okay.
I'm ready for it. We need it after all that murder.
Yeah. So shortly after the attacks on the Cortimiglia family, an infamous letter was sent to the media and published by the newspaper, the Times. I'm not sure if it's Picayune or Picayune.
This comes up in my episode for March. This newspaper.
Yo, that's cool.
So I don't know how to say it either.
Well, I'm going to spell it. Times, Picayune. Oh, we looked it up. It is the Times Picayune. Supposedly, this letter was sent by the Axeman himself, and I'm going to read it. Here you go. The letter is dated, Hell, March 13th, 1919. Esteemed mortal, they have never caught me, and they never will. They have never seen me, for I am invisible, even as the ether that surrounds your earth. I am not a human being, but a spirit and a demon from the hottest hell. I am what you Orleanians and your foolish police call the Axeman. When I see fit, I shall come and claim other victims. I alone know whom they shall be. I shall leave no clue except my bloody axe besmeared with the blood and brains of he who I have sent below to keep me company. If you wish, you may tell the police to be careful not to rile me. Of course, I am a reasonable spirit. I take no offense at the way they have conducted their investigations in the past. In fact, they have been so utterly stupid as to not only amuse me, but His Satanic Majesty, Francis Joseph, etc. But tell them to beware. Let them not try to discover what I am, for it were better that they were never born than incur the wrath of the Axeman. I don't think there is any need of such a warning, for I feel sure the police will always dodge me as they have in the past. They are wise and know how to keep away from all harm. Undoubtedly, you Orleanians think of me as a most horrible murderer, which I am, but I could be much worse if I wanted to. If I wished, I could pay a visit to your city every night. At will, I could slay thousands of your best citizens, for I am in close relationship with the angel of death. Now to be exact, at 12:15, parentheses, earthly time, on next Tuesday night, I am going to pass over New Orleans. In my infinite mercy, I'm going to make a little proposition to you people. Here it is. I am very fond of jazz music, and I swear by all the devils in the nether regions that every person shall be spared in whose home a jazz band is in full swing at the time I have just mentioned. If everyone has a jazz band going, well, then so much the better for you people. One thing is certain, and that is that some of your people who do not jazz it out in Pacific Tuesday night if there be any, will get the axe. Well, as I am cold and crave the warmth of my native Tartarus, and it is about time I leave your earthly home, I will cease my discourse, hoping that thou wilt publish this, that it may go well with thee. I have been and am and will be the worst spirit that ever existed, either in fact or realm of fantasy. Signed, the Axeman. I'm gonna say it. The letter writer is a jackass, like a smarmy. So there is. I'm gonna give a little spoiler here. There's evidence, or well, not evidence. There's debate over whether this letter was actually sent by the murderer himself.
You mean it wasn't sent from the hottest hell?
It wasn't, shockingly. Or if the letter was a hoax. And I believe historians tend to believe this letter was a hoax written by someone. What a smarmy asshole. And truly, like, we're not laughing or joking about this because it's funny. It's just so, especially because I'm going to say it probably is a hoax.
Yeah.
And not actually sent by the murderer. It's just like, what the hell is happening?
Can you imagine?
Like,
it's really well written like fantasy. Also, it's
fanfic.
It is
fanfic.
Oh my God. So someone probably really admired this because there are people that really admire and look up to serial killers.
Yeah.
And they were like, man, I'm going to make this guy look a lot smarter than he is.
Right.
And a demon.
And
a demon. And I really enjoy how the last paragraph-ish of the letter completely switched to like King James Version Bible English.
Yeah, it like, where did thou wilt publish this?
Hoping that thou wilt publish this, it may go well with thee.
And then, but it's not anywhere else. And like I said, how they're indicating, I was talking about how smarmy this guy is. They're talking about like, oh, the police are just not catching this guy because they know like, oh, if they catch me, they're going to be in trouble.
Very full of himself.
Yes. Like, you narcissistic jackweed. Like,
you narcissistic jackweed. That's a nice insult. I like that one. Oh my goodness.
Written by Fallout Boy.
But then it's actually about like going to prom with some girl.
Correct.
Once again, we're not laughing because this is funny. We're laughing because this is just kind of ridiculous.
Yes, correct. There's the letter, friends. The Tuesday being referred to in the letter was Tuesday, March 18th, 1919. On this night, and I'm not kidding when I say this, citizens all over New Orleans decided to heed the warning and played jazz in their homes and in dance halls and clubs all across the city. True to what the letter stated, no attacks occurred that night. But we already said this, there is debate over whether this letter was actually sent by the killer or if it was a hoax. Some historians and criminal profilers don't believe the profile of the actual murderer and the profile of the person writing the letter fit. It's to them, they're like, this sounds like it was not written by the profile of a person who would actually commit these murders. And I feel like I kind of agree with them because it's just so weirdly written. It just doesn't make any sense.
I mean, there is some really interesting duplicity in some people.
That's true. That is true.
It could be an axe killer and then also a really intense fan fiction writer.
Yeah. That's really, really full of himself.
Is it still a fan fiction if you write it about yourself, or is it a biography?
What is that, a self-insert? Also, I want to be clear, we're not making fun of fan fiction writers either.
We are not. We are not.
We're not. Can I say we both read fanfic? We both read fan fiction, so we're not making fun of fanfic writers here. We are 100% making fun of the person that wrote this, because how dare you?
We wouldn't know this much about fan fiction if we didn't read it.
You're right.
just saying.
Keep creating, creators.
Yes.
Whatever makes you happy, it's awesome. One theory that I do want to talk about here is that the letter was actually sent in by a musician and composer, Joseph John Davila. Davila composed the jazz piece, The Mysterious Axeman's Jazz, Don't Scare Me, Papa, in response to the letter posted by the supposed killer, and he claimed he had been inspired by it. one of my sources actually states he wrote the piece in the early hours of the morning of Wednesday the 19th, once he was sure that, okay, the killer isn't going to come by my home and get me, essentially. By Thursday, the morning after the night of jazz, as I'm going to call it, Davila was actually selling the sheet music for this piece to the public.
So, hold on. So this happened on a Thursday.
The
night of jazz, the jazz Passover.
Yes, as we'll call it.
The great jazz Passover happened on a Tuesday. He supposedly wrote the piece of music on a Wednesday and then was selling copies of it
the next day.
That is not. I mean, there are like prodigies that can do that, but that.
Who was it? Beethoven that wrote the one symphony,
like the morning of.
And, you know, this isn't a full sympathy. This wasn't a full symphony, but still, like, that's a lot.
But he would have had to compose the music, figure it out, and then make multiple copies.
To sell to the public by Thursday morning. Yeah.
Was he doing the copies by hand?
That I don't know. That I'm not sure.
Anyways, that just seems...
It's awful,
like,
sus.
At least wait until the following Monday. That way you would have had time to write it out.
Right. So, according to the article, and I think I meant to write in the Smithsonian Magazine, the Axeman disappeared after the attacks on the Cortimiglia family. Unfortunately, while no attacks had occurred the night of March 18th into the 19th, they did not stop altogether. I do want to say here, full transparency, I'm not certain if these attacks are 100% canonical to the Axeman. The lineup article and Wikipedia stated they were.
The next two, you mean?
The next three murders.
I can't do math, apparently. That's next three murders.
Yes. So I'm going to include them here. Again, I say I really tried with this, guys. My eyes were starting to go trying to cross-reference all my stuff. Steve Boca was attacked on August 10th, 1919, so several months after this, quote, jazz Passover. Steve woke from sleeping to find an intruder hovering over him before he was bludgeoned with an axe. Despite his head wound, Steve was able to make his way to the home and a friend and fellow grocer, Frank Janusa, where he collapsed and fell into unconsciousness. Steve did thankfully survive his injuries, but he couldn't remember any details about his attacker after the fact. Sticking to the pattern here. Police once again found a panel of the back door had, once again, been chiseled out. I didn't see in any of my sources anywhere that an axe was found at the scene in this case.
Took it with him.
He possibly took it with him. But the door panel being chiseled out is definitely part of that pattern. Mm-hmm. So seems pretty like a calling card. The next attack is Miss Sarah Lauman, which occurred on September 3rd, 1919, so a month later. Sarah was young. She was only 19 years old, and she lived alone. Neighbors had come to check in on her, but that when she didn't answer their calls or their knocks, they broke into her home to discover her lying unconscious in bed, covered in blood. She had a severe head injury, which was later found to be caused by a blunt force object, and she was missing several teeth.
Ugh.
Yeah. Thankfully, she did survive the attack and her injuries, but as was the pattern, couldn't remember anything about her attacker. Police did find in this case, rather than a door panel being chiseled out, the attacker had got in through an open window. They also did find an axe on the front lawn. Not the door chisel, but if a window was open, why would you take the effort to chisel a door panel
That's true.
out? You know?
That is true.
The last one, and this is the one that I'm most shaky on of if this was actually committed by the Axeman. Again, it was considered canonical in the Wikipedia and the lineup article. There are some big differences here. So the final attack was on Mike Pepitone, and it occurred the night of October 27th, 1919. Pepitone and his wife, Esther, were sleeping in bed when Esther suddenly awoke to find Mike being brutally attacked. Esther woke due to her husband's screaming. And trigger warning, this, again, is brutal. Mike was violently hit 18 times around the head and was bleeding profusely. Esther saw 2 dark figures fleeing the scene, but was unable to get any accurate descriptions of them other than saying they were just large. 2 large gentlemen, I'm assuming. Well, not gentlemen, but... In this case, the murder weapon was described as a heavy nut and bolt, similar to the type of tool that is used to anchor down circus tents, which is a big deviation. And there had been a circus in town that past weekend. I want to note here, the wiki article stated that Esther actually saw her husband's assailant attacking him with an axe, and only mentioned 1 assailant rather than 2. So I was a little confused here. But there were a couple different places stating about the nut and bolt circus tent apparatus. So I'm inclined to believe that was the murder weapon. And I want to note here, the Smithsonian article I used in my research indicated that this particular murder could have been related to a vendetta attack than being attacked by an attack by the Axeman. Which, again, this is a pretty big deviation. You know, the guy bludgeoned people, but 18 times is pretty extreme. And if it wasn't an axe, if it was that circus tent, I'm assuming it's like a tent stake with a nut attached to the top of it is what they're talking about. That's a very specific weapon.
That seems really personal of an attack too. Like,
yes.
To try and take someone out and like bludgeon them 18 times. It's not like you're just trying to, I don't know, but.
Right. So that was the end of the attacks. At least in New Orleans. There were some notes here and there that I read about other attacks occurring that potentially could have been contributed to him, or not contributed, associated with him. But the long and short of it is, we don't know who this dude was, or dudette, or anything in between. The most common theory is that the crimes were, or at least what I understand to be the most common theory, is that the crimes were racially motivated, as a lot of them were directed at Italian immigrants and their families. And to this day, the case of the Axeman of New Orleans remains unsolved. He disappeared into the ether.
When did DNA testing become a thing? I mean, it was way after that.
Yeah, that I don't know for certain. I have to look that up.
Did I have this conversation with you or someone else that, like, it would have, like, it must have been so much easier to get away with this kind of stuff in, like, you know, 100 years ago, 50 years ago. Yeah. Because, like, before DNA, before, like, surveillance cameras even.
And witness statements, you know, they would have relied very heavily on them. We still rely on them today, but they're not the most solid evidence because the mind will play tricks on you. Even if you don't mean it to, you know, you get confirmation bias in your own brain, like. So I think especially in this time with targeting the specific people that this killer was targeting would have been easier as well. They already had a bad rap. So people were already like brushing them under the rug and treating them as less than, which is terrible. No one deserves to be treated like that.
No. It sounds like it was very complicated. And also, like, even the people that weren't Italian immigrants that were victims were still immigrants. Yeah. From what I could understand, I think all of these people were immigrants or were not, like, I hate to use this term, but, like, quote, full American. They were, like, Italian American or, you know, I hate using that term. They were, like, the minority ethnicities of the area.
Yes. Sorry, I was getting dry.
Okay.
So, do you want to go back to your theory about chiseling the door panel up and going and unlocking the door?
Well, because I think I kind of remember this from either the BuzzFeed Unsolved or the Time Suck. It's like the panels that were being chiseled out were small.
Yeah, they weren't real big.
Like, and even like a full adult woman would have had a hard time.
So, I had that thought too, and you had mentioned about someone reaching up and unlocking the door. Yeah. That's what I was going to say. This episode was covered on Morbid, and I had listened to it a long time ago. And I didn't want to, listen to it and then do my research because I didn't want to be influenced by it.
Yeah.
But I went back and listened to it afterwards just to see if there was anything that they had covered that I had missed. And they had actually covered one thing about suspect wise, but I didn't get too far into that because it was strictly on Wikipedia. I didn't see too much about it, but they said the same thing. I wonder if they were going up and unlocking the door, which I think that's a solid thought, but nothing was noted about when the police were on the scene. They just noted that chiseled out panel. They didn't say the door was unlocked.
Unless they relocked it. Which is... Because they could have unlocked it and then closed it and locked it behind them.
That's a thought. I didn't think about that.
See New Orleans police of the early 1900s?
We got it.
We figured it out. We figured that part out for you. But, because it would have had,
And even, I was thinking, okay, well, maybe in the thought of, okay, we don't know who this person was. It could have been a woman. But I was thinking, I'm unless she was dressing in drag... Because the one person did describe them, a heavy-set man wearing a slouch hat and a suit. I was like, well, it would be more possible, I think, typically for a woman to get through, especially if she was smaller stature. But if she was wearing the women's clothing at the time, they weren't wearing, the giant hoop skirts and everything of, the Victorian era. Mm-hmm. But you were still wearing a fair amount. You were wearing petticoats. Some people were wearing... I think the bum roll would have been... bum roll might not have been in use in that time. That was for listeners, I'm going to try to describe this. It kind of gave your skirt... It was almost like a pillow that was, tied around your waist. And it gave the skirts the illusion of being, bustled back a little bit. But not quite so dramatically as, the Wild West shows where you see, they look like they're wearing an entire circus tent on their back end. I think it would have been harder to crawl through a door wearing the undergarments of a woman in that time. And not saying it's not possible, because, I don't know. It's just weird. The whole thing is weird.
Even if it was a girl, I highly doubt they'd be wearing the undergarments of a girl at that time, though.
Yeah.
Right? If you're going in to, bludgeon someone to death, you're going to be wearing clothes that you can dispose of.
That's true. That's true, too.
I haven't thought about this a lot, I promise.
No, but it's just...
because you're going to get blood on you.
Yeah. And I want to cover this case later, too. It reminds me of the Lizzie Borden case where they found a dress that she had burned. That was supposedly she burned it because
not suspicious at all.
Covered in red paint. Yeah. Lizzie, my girl. Question.
If it's premeditated enough that they're taking the stuff with the chisel, the door out, I don't think you would wear your normal clothes to do that because you're going to have to dispose of it somehow.
Right.
Also, if you're locking the door as you leave, you might give yourself a little bit of a head start.
That's true.
Right?
Yeah.
Until someone's able, to discover the victims, they'll have to get through the door or they'll have to get in somehow.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And the case where they saw the assailant running away, they're was that one where the door was chiseled in, or was that just a...
There were a couple. Let me go back and double check here. Pepitone, the white Esther saw the assailants. This one didn't state if the door was chiseled out or not, so I'm not certain of that one. Sarah Lauman was the window.
Because why chisel in a door if you can get through an open window?
If you can get through an open window, right. Steve Boca, that it was only him. There was no one else to witness the escape, and he was probably pretty stupid, getting nailed in the face by an axe, so I don't know that he saw. But that one was chiseled out. Cortimiglia, the door was chiseled out.
Okay.
Joseph Romano.
That's the one where the two nieces saw him.
Correct, yes.
That's the one I'm thinking of.
That's the one you were thinking of?
Uh-huh.
The door was chiseled out in that case, yes. The door was chiseled out in many of them. Do you want me to keep going, or?
No, we're good. Okay. Two other thoughts, if that's...
Yeah, go for it.
So another one is that on the surface, I think it seems weird that none of the survivors remembered what the person looked like, but then you also have, like, blunt force trauma to the head, so I guess that's not as...
Yeah. And I don't know. I suppose it's possible they were carrying some kind of light with them. I'm not sure if, like...
Oh, it'd be really dark, too.
Yeah. It would have been dark as pitch. I don't know that flashlights would have been a thing at this time, but I don't know if they were carrying, like, lanterns or anything. Like I said, it's possible that the person was carrying a lantern, but either way, like, I know this from reenacting, and if anyone camps, you probably know, like, lanterns, especially when you're disoriented and, like, actively being attacked, don't cast a whole lot of light. So even if the killer sat it in a corner somewhere, that's not going to show their face very well.
And I would almost think that would be in the reports if there was, unless they took it with them, but also that would take away the element of surprise.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, it's kind of, you know, that blunt force trauma in and of itself, plus just your frantic, like, fight or flight is kicked in. You're just trying to keep alive, you know. Terrible.
I can't think of what the third thing was now.
Oh, that's okay.
I don't know. It's okay. The episode's going to be long enough without it.
Yeah. I just want to say, too, because I kind of moved on pretty quick from the letter, and I didn't see a whole lot of else theories of who could have wrote that letter. I really am suspicious of Mr. Davila. And I did see in one of the articles, but he was kind of a self-promoter. So I really, really hope that he didn't, especially because that letter was published like a week after that awful attack on the Cortimiglia family. Like, I really hope you didn't do that after that family was so, like, you didn't take advantage of a brutal murder of an entire family to promote your music. But the
people are twisted.
Yeah, the people are twisted, and the evidence stacking up against him.
There were no other letters written to...
No, not in this case, no. Just that one.
All right, are you ready for questions?
I'm ready for questions.
What drew you to this topic?
I was looking for a New Orleans themed topic for the month of Marti Gras. Which is March. And I heard of this case, again, on the Morbid podcast. I wanted to take my own stab at researching it and just see what I could find.
It's okay. It wasn't, stab is a pun here, but, like, he wasn't stabbing. He was hatcheting.
Yeah.
So.
Take my own swipe, if you will.
Take my own swing at it?
Yeah, take my own swing at it.
We should take that all out.
Sorry.
We should take that all out.
Yes.
All right. How did this episode change your view on the topic?
So it did change it a little bit. It's much more complicated than I remembered it was. Like I said, I knew of this case, but I hadn't actually listened to it in a really long time. And I struggled with finding what I considered to be truly reliable research, in particular about the details in some of these cases. So I just think, and learning about the history of the immigration and everything that was happening beforehand, it just really opened my eyes to, like, man, this was a pretty nasty environment that just fed all this.
What did you find the most strange about this topic?
If this is actually the way it went, the fact that some fool decided to make money by writing a jazz piece based on the brutal murders of several people, including a child.
Did it sell?
I think so, yeah. I tried to find it, and I did find a jazz piece on YouTube that stated it was the Axeman's jazz, but I don't know if it's, like, the correct piece or not. So I don't know if I'm going to post it, just because I don't want to post the wrong thing.
Okay. All right. So we would love to hear from you. If you have a suggestion for a strange or mysterious topic, a comment about an episode, or just want to chat, please reach out. You can comment directly on episodes on Spotify, or leave a review on either Spotify or Apple Podcasts. For Spotify, you can do the individual episodes. For Apple, it's the entire series. Or you can find us on Instagram at something_strangepod. You can also send us an email at somethingstrangepod24@gmail.com.
Well, strangers, it's time for us to part ways.
Until we meet again, put a jazz record on.
We'll be back again soon with another
Something Strange.
Did you really think that Bree and I, the pair of has-been hotel fangirls that we are, could really resist not bringing up Alistair the Radio Demon in an episode that's so heavily revolved around jazz? Didn't think so.
nothing but a spirit and a demon from the hottest hell. Hello, Alistair. That's not in the letter. I just added that.
We're not saying you're the Axeman. We're saying that you decided to mess with everyone.
You were a troll, my friend. I'm here to lie. Come on the podcast and read the Axeman letter.
Oh my, okay.
Alistair, we know it was you. Come forward. I feel like this was Alistair and Rosie that just got they drunk off their asses, and they were like, we should do this.
He was still alive at that point. Young Alistair was probably like, this idiot. He's doing murder wrong. He's doing murder wrong.
That's what inspired Alistair.
I'm going to show him in about 10 years how to do murder right.
Yes.
But I'm going to write a letter I'm going to write a letter to the police to show him how he should do it.
Yes, that's correct. He was just trolling.
You know what?
While his mother was making jambalaya.
What are you doing, dear? Nothing. Go ahead.
Okay, guys. Sorry. We gotta laugh or else we're gonna cry. This is a rough episode. Alright, let's see.
Hey, strangers. Post-episode Christiana here. We just wanted to say that while we are truly a couple of nerds at heart and we love to have fun, we want to be clear that we weren't laughing or joking around here because we thought this case was funny. These attacks were brutal, and we extend the utmost respect to the victims, survivors, and anyone impacted by these crimes. We simply couldn't resist a little fun at the expense of the infamous hoax letter, and after discussing so many brutal attacks, we needed a little bit of a palate cleanser. Anyway, we hope you enjoyed these outtakes, and we hope that you continue to tune on in for more Something Strange.